So this is the practical outworking of a person whose life has been crucified with Christ. They have crucified their life with their passions and their desires.
Welcome to Reach College with your guest speaker, Pastor Matthew O'Malley.
Okay, if I haven't met you yet, I'm Matt. I'd love to meet you. If I have met you, I might ask your name again, right? I've done that already this morning. It's fine, you know. I meet you guys over and over and in different contexts, and there's a lot of people, so it's fine. But what I am going to do this morning, I believe next week Taylor is coming back to round out his series on Romans, correct? I think that's correct, yeah. So I had the idea of, what could be really practical is looking at the book of Galatians. But before we do that, can anyone share with me so far, I know you're not covering the entire book of Romans, but can you share with me so far what some of the main things that you've been looking at in Romans is? Like, give me some summary ideas, some key points, some key takeaways. And while you tell me that, I'm going to write some stuff on the board because I totally forgot that there's not like a projector in here. So I'm going to start writing some things. So yeah, Romans. Anyone got their notebooks or anything that they can tell me?
The point is loving God, not following a list of rules.
Okay. Loving God and not following a list of rules. That is a very big point. Is that like the main point that we've seen so far in Romans that you guys have been looking at? Yes, no? My back is to you, so you'll have to speak up.
I know at one point, Paul, in the first chapter, Paul's like talking to the Jews and sort of talking about how things basically have changed. Because I know the audience was mixed between Gentiles and Jews at the time. And he was really differentiating what the gospel is to them because they were still kind of in their old kind of ways.
Yeah, that's a really big point. Can someone expand on that a little bit? Because what's happening in the first century is the Jews and the Gentiles that were first century believers, they're colliding in a lot of areas. Can someone expound on what we've seen in Romans so far on that? Or was there much else? I don't know. I wasn't here for any of Taylor's messages on that. I just know what Romans is talking about, so I don't know what all he's covered specifically. That's why we're doing this. It's kind of a recap. Well, anything else, though, about Romans? That's big, because the reason I wanted to choose Galatians was because of what you've been doing in Romans so far. I'll write some more as we go. But does anyone know what the relationship between Romans and Galatians is?
Written by the same guy.
They are written by the same guy. That is perfect. So they're written by the same guy, and so far everything you've said is exactly why I chose Galatians, because it's also the same reason that Paul wrote Galatians, that there were arguments between Jews and Gentiles, that there were, both believing and kind of non-believing, but Jews and Gentiles were arguing in the first century church. There was the discussion about the laws, about the rules, what we do or don't need to do as believers under the new covenant, and trying to just work out what this new covenant is, because salvation from sin through the gospel of Jesus Christ was through a new covenant, and the Jews and all those that were familiar with the Jews. It's, back then, especially in Judaism, in Israel, like, worship was a very public thing in a lot of ways. And so for us today in Oklahoma, there's, a lot of us probably know people who are Jewish, but we don't see them worshiping on a regular basis, so we're not familiar necessarily with what they do or don't do. So even the Gentile believers in Galatia or Rome or wherever, they would have been familiar with what the Jews were doing. And so there was this argument of saying, hey, you know this thing that us Jews do now, you got to do it also. And then there's these arguments going back and forth. Of course, we don't have to do those things, but they were used to thinking, well, there's the law of Moses. We all have to follow that. And there's this big argument about whether or not we do that. So looking at Galatians, what I want to do this morning is just do a quick overview. We're going to sprinkle in some verses here or there, but I want you to be able to kind of come away with Galatians kind of in your hip pocket, knowing what's going on in Galatians. It's a difficult thing to understand the Bible on a broad scale because we're so used to memorizing just single verses or understanding little stories here or there. But to know the Bible on a big scale is kind of difficult, but it's actually not too hard once you start thinking about it and understanding what's the overall picture, what's the overall message. Of course, it's Jesus and the gospel. Those things are true, but why was each book written? Why were each letter written? So what we're going to look at with Galatians is, why did Paul write to the Galatians? What's Paul's main point? Why has it continued to be included in the Bible for 2,000 years? Some of those are really big technical questions, and people want to talk about the canonization of Scripture. We're not doing that this morning, but just why was it written in the first place? Why has it continued to be as important as it is? All right? And then also, I want to do the obvious thing, which we've already been working on, which is connecting it to Romans. Romans is, from all we know, most likely written at the end of Paul's life, right before he was executed in Rome. Galatians was written probably really early in his message. And so Galatians is kind of shorthand Romans, right? It's the early thing that Paul wrote of him attacking the people that were trying to lead people astray from the true gospel, and him just kind of, using some fighting words. That's what Galatians is. And then Romans is him doing the exact same thing, but it's old Paul that's been, hammered through life, and he's seen some things, and he knows really how to lay this out. And an important thing to know about what to look at with the epistles are the letters that we have from starting in Romans up through Jude in the New Testament. They are the letters written to specific people or specific churches, but generally they aren't necessarily telling a story. They're not narrative. They're not poetic. They are, in one term, they would call them prose discourse. So they are argumentative. They are kind of laying out logic. There's a lot of if-then type of logic that we see there, especially in Paul's writing. He'll say, people are saying this, and you see that, and then this. Well, it's like, well, if you think that, well, then this is why you're wrong, and that's kind of how Paul lays things out. And we're going to see that this morning looking at Galatians. And so it's important to understand that when you're reading the epistles, especially Paul's writing, because he is laying out an argumentation about why the gospel is the way it is, why Christ is the Messiah, why they need to live this way or that way when it comes to living in the Spirit and not under the law. He lays out logical arguments. So that's what we want to look at this morning, and just kind of get that understanding and get Galatians in our hip pocket so we know why it exists and why or where it fits in the New Testament. So, like I said, Galatians is likely one of Paul's earliest letters. It was written to a church that he had planted early in his missionary journeys. And the main letter, it's scathing, kind of start to finish. And it was fun for me as I was studying. I preached about this on Tuesday night as well. If you weren't at Reach, we looked at faith in Galatians and did communion on Tuesday night. Pause. I'm talking real fast. But what was interesting is I haven't, in doing ministry and stuff, I've kind of gone through different phases of the way I study and look at things. And lately, I've just been so entertained by jumping between translations, right? And just looking at different translations. Yeah, I've got a bajillion commentaries, and I look at those things too, and that can be a lot of fun. But just understanding the different verbiage that's found in the different English translations, especially as I read Paul, because this is a guy writing a letter to people he loves. And it's just, I feel like I know Paul more the more I read in these different translations, because, when you know a person, you get used to the way that they talk, right? And as they grow, they might learn different phrases. I'm not being super spiritual at all. I'm just saying this is what's been entertaining to me as I've been reading Galatians, because I've been reading in the New Living Translation. My normal that I preach from is ESV, because I like the grammar and stuff that's in there, but I like to read the NLT. It's fun to read. The Message is fun. It's not a translation, I know that. But when Paul's getting real spicy, it's really fun to see how Eugene Peterson writes the spice into it with his old man modern language that he uses. It's pretty funny. So if you have a Message, or you can pull it up on your phone, especially, I might not get to it this morning, but in Galatians 5, we all know Galatians 5. What do you think of? Anyone? Fruits of the Spirit. Right before that, he's talking about, the things that the flesh does. Read what Eugene Peterson says there. It is spicy, and it will, it really perks up your ears, because it's not just like big words like fornication or whatever, but he just really lays it out, and I love it. So, like I said, I'm not being spiritual at all with that, but it's just, I like when you read a book, a specific letter over and over, and that's the best way to kind of get the handle. I want to know this book well. I want to know where it fits within the broader narrative of the gospel, within the broader narrative of the Bible overall. Just read it over and over. Read it a couple of times one day in the ESV, a couple of times the next day in the New Living Translation, and things start to stick. You start to it's like when you've watched a movie so many times, you can quote it over and over without even batting an eye, right? Ethan, who was quoting most of episode 3 of Star Wars this morning to us. One scene, but it was flawless because he's seen it a lot. So it's the same thing as we study the Bible, because what I run into a lot, even in my own life, or talking to my wife, who's right here. This is Kiva. It's always like, I read these things, but I don't know why it exists or why it's there. And it seems less spiritual to just like step back and look at things on a broad scale, but don't let that deceive you. Like, understanding God's word on a broad scale makes the gospel like connect dots and come alive and make more sense. You don't have to sit down and parse verbs in Greek in order to be spiritual. It seems like doing that crazy hard work is spiritual, but yeah, it's not. I see your face over there. That's not extra spiritual. You're just a nerd. But understanding God and falling in love with His Word, that however we do it, and we all learn differently, but being able to do that in a way that makes something come alive to where you feel confident about it. That idea of like, oh, I got it in my hip pocket. Like, it's kind of like having that magic trick or that little that party trick. Like, we want to have, not that the gospel is a party trick, but we want to feel like I'm confident I can pull out this thing and explain to you in a minute what Galatians is about. And that's what we want to do whenever we study the Bible, is whatever the thing we're working on, we want to be able to really ingest it and be confident with God's word. So, going back to what was happening, why is there a connection between Romans and Galatians? So, in Galatians specifically, the Judaizers are mentioned. The Judaizers, they came in and they ham-fisted the old laws, trying to force them on New Testament Gentile believers. And Paul is super mad about that. He didn't want them to be distracted, and he didn't want them to take on what he's calling even just another gospel, a false gospel. And so he reminds them, and we'll see this here in a minute, he reminds them that not only has he already delivered the gospel to them, but even the Old Testament that the Judaizers are claiming to hold up into high regard, or back then it wasn't the Old Testament, it was the Scriptures. And they're saying, oh, we're trying to hold this up in higher regard than these Gentiles or Paul, who are throwing these laws out the window. Paul's saying, no, the gospel of faith is already present in the Old Testament. He has a whole large section where he's laying out saying, look at all these examples in the Old Testament where he points to faith, not works. And that's a huge deal. So that is what Paul is doing as well. That's his argumentation, laying that out. He takes this very seriously, that we have to be all in on faith or law. Like, if you're going to choose law, you got to be all in on it. But then he reminds us, being all in on law means you're going to fail. And there's a curse that comes with that. So it's either, do you want success or not? Faith is the only way that leads to success, because the law leads to failure. And he wants those that are trying to push, he speaks very harshly about those that are trying to push the law on the Galatians. That's for another time. So it's pretty rough. He's not happy about it, but he's not messing around. He wants all those who want to go back to the old ways of righteousness. He's he just basically shreds their position, because of anyone that could shred their position, it's Paul, right? And we see that in other books where he points out that he's, a Jew among Jews, a Pharisee of Pharisees. Like, he knows what he's talking about. He was one of them. And I think that's part of why he's so angry and so spicy in this book. One, because it's young Paul, and we're angry and spicy when we're young. And we mellow out as we get older. And if you don't, well, then you need to mature, guys, as you get older. You're supposed to be mellowing out a little bit. Trust me, that's what happens. It does. I have a few kids, and you start to get tired. But what we see Paul doing is what I think a lot of us are susceptible to. Has anyone in here ever had a sin that you struggle with, that God has grown and matured you through to where then you're kind of on the back end of succeeding over it, and now you see it everywhere in other people, and it makes you just so angry, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? It's like, yeah, you lose, we so quickly forget where we came from that we lose our ability to have grace on those that are in the exact same spot I was 10 minutes ago, right? I kind of think that's what Paul's doing here. With good reason, right? The church in Galatia is being led astray, but that's why Paul's so angry. Because it is kind of sort of his people, right? The Judaizers, these Pharisaical people wanting to claim Christ, but they're trying to push the law on people. And it's like, I know your game. It's like me raising my kids, and there's one in particular, the younger one, where it's like, you're acting like me. I know your game, and I'm so angry about it. I have such a hard time having grace on him because he's acting like me, and I hate it. And I hate seeing it in the mirror. And I think that's what we're seeing here from Paul. But he wraps up in a very good way, a very pastoral way. And that's where we get the fruits of the Spirit that we see at the end of Galatians, because he shreds them at the first 2/3 of the book, and then the last of it, he gives us one of the most memorable parts of all the New Testament, right? The fruit of the Spirit. And we're going to get to that here in a second. But as we get into that now, let's look at some of the things. I think the summary verse is verse 1:4. And what's fun is going back to the exercise of trying to get a book and just really understand one book of the Bible. A good way of doing that is writing an outline. Not overly detailed, but kind of like breaking it down into sections. And through different lenses, you can, without trying to manipulate the text, but through a different lens, you can see different ways of outlining the text. And this morning, I want to look at the gospel in Galatians. That's kind of my title. I didn't write it up there, but the gospel in Galatians. That's what I want us to see this morning. There's obviously a lot going on there about the Judaizers and faith versus law and all that stuff. But what I want us to see this morning is the gospel in, I'm so bad at writing, Galatians. But summary verse 1:4. Can someone read that for me? I would love for someone to read it. I've got the ESV. If you got something different, awesome. Let's hear it.
I got a bit.
What you got for me?
Galatians 1:4, right?
Uh-huh.
Who gave himself for our sins so that he might rescue us from this present evil age according to the will of our God and Father.
Awesome. So the who, you go back a word. It's Jesus, right? The New Living Translation says Jesus gave himself for our sins just as God our Father planned in order to rescue us from this evil world in which we live. And the reason I think that this is a good summary verse is think again of who, what, when, where, why. He is writing to the Galatians who are being led astray by people trying to lord over them with the laws of the Old Testament scriptures, right? And so right from the get-go, this is in the introductory. If you've read other letters of Paul, it's usually saying, basically it's like, hey, this is Paul, grace and peace. Like, I'm so excited. He's just doing nice, lovely pastoral things. But right from the get-go, I feel like you can see his motivation. You can see his ulterior motive in writing to the Galatians here. He says, Jesus gave his life for our sins just as God our Father planned, right? Where do we know God's plan from? The Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, right? And so he is getting mad about the Judaizers leaving them away, or leading the new believers away, the Gentile believers away from the gospel of faith. And so right from the get-go, you can see this is what Paul's writing about. It's kind of if you're in school and you learn how to write an essay, right? You have a paragraph about what you're going to tell them, then you tell them the stuff, and then you tell them what you told them. That's what Paul's doing here. Like in this one sentence, He's in verse 1:4, Jesus gave his life for our sins. That was God's plan. That's how he's going to rescue us. Judaizers, listen up. So I think if you want to understand Galatians, think about 1:4 and understand who he's writing to and why he's writing. And I think you'll understand Galatians well enough that you can have confidence about why it fits there and why we have it, right? So going a little bit from that, there's a few hinge verses, and I've got several here. We got 2:16 and 20, 3:10, and then the fruits of the Spirit, 5:22 through 23. I would love someone else to read any of those. Yeah, what you got for me?
Galatians 2:16. Yet we know that a person is made right with God by faith in Jesus Christ, not by obeying the law. And we have believed in Christ Jesus so that we might be made right with God because of our faith in Christ, not because we have obeyed the law. For no one will ever be made right with God by obeying the law.
Awesome. No one will be made right with God from obeying the law. Just right out the gate. That is what Paul is writing about and why he's writing about it. The works of the law. This, in this context, one of the things they talk about, not a ton, but it's brought up towards the end, is circumcision. But there's also the food laws and Sabbath laws and all these things. These are human efforts that people improperly, the Jews improperly thought that that was what was justifying them to be made right with God. But it wasn't following the laws that justified them to be made right with God. It was their faith in what God had said, right? And we're going to see that here in a second when we're looking at more in there. But over and over, it was never them doing the right things. One of my favorites, Psalm 51, when David is laying out his heart after his sin, and with Bathsheba. And what does he say? He says, I would give you these sacrifices if you cared, God, but what you want is a broken and contrite heart, right? What you want is a heart of faith that is turned towards you. That's what God cares about. And that is a consistent theme throughout all of the Old Testament, and it is really just hammered on in the New Testament because that is what brings us faith. That is why this is what I think is a hinge verse for what the gospel in Galatians looks like, is that we are only justified by faith, not by works of the law. And that's what you guys have been looking at in Romans so far. So by faith, these believers, Paul is trying to remind them that they are justified through the completed work of Christ and Christ alone, right? That through Christ, that they can find justification because of what he did for them, not what we can do on our own. Galatians 2:20. Someone got that for me?
I got it. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me.
Awesome. So this isn't hammering as much on the law anymore, but this is the fact that what ultimately gives us life and gives us justification in the face of God is the new life found only in Christ, right? That's why I think this is another one of those hinge verses. You can even read those. I read these just on their own straight through, and I feel like I was kind of getting a sense of what Paul was saying about, right? Like I said, this is an exercise. This isn't a way to manipulate the text and make it look a certain way, but we're just trying to understand what's Paul's main theme, and where can I just really see, it's like looking at an EKG. Where's that like really bumping up, like Paul's like hammering in? This is what's going on here. And I think Galatians 2:20 is definitely one of those. So I've been crucified with Christ. That's an important thing to understand. It's a common thing that we see when someone is even just giving a gospel presentation, that it's not me who's alive. It's not me who continues to persist. It is Christ who lives in and through me. So I've been crucified with Christ. Paul is saying that his former self, the person that Paul was before he trusted Christ, which is the reason I think he's so angry at the Judaizers, thinking about Pharisee Saul before he was Paul, that person has been, with all of his sinful goals and his lusts and his desire for power and justification and self-exaltation, those things that had been deceiving him about thinking that he was right with God, those things have died. Those things have been put to death, and there is a new life found in Christ. Going back to Star Wars for a minute, there's the paradox of Darth Vader and Anakin, right? So Obi-Wan tells Anakin, if you haven't seen Star Wars in here, you got homework to do. Obi-Wan in the original movie tells Luke that Anakin was killed by Darth Vader, right? So there's that paradox of it's no longer this person. That person's dead and gone, right? Now we know in the end that Anakin was still there, and then he has a redemption, and yay Star Wars. But that was the first thing that came to my mind when I was looking at this. That like, what's that mean for me as a person? That my sinful fleshly self has been put to death, and that person no longer has rule or control of my life. That's why if I can depend on the Spirit, I can then walk well with the Spirit, and I don't have to succumb to that. But it is a constant battle that we go through, kind of like Anakin, but not really. But what Paul is saying, though, is that his personal goals of his life, those no longer direct his life. Rather, it is Christ that lives in him, that is empowering him and enabling him to do what he does. It's not Paul looking for approval. It's not Paul looking to make a point and be, superhero Christian in the first century. It's Christ working in and through him, not just as a minister, but just as a disciple in general. All right, Galatians 3:10. Who's got that verse for me?
For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, because it is written, everyone who does not continue doing everything written in the book of the law is cursed.
All right. Now that kind of just lays it out. There's a lot about works and law that Paul's talking about in here, and that kind of, to me, was if I could pick one verse about it, it was like saying, all right, if you try to do the law on your own, you're under a curse. And there's a whole lot in the Old Testament that points to that, to understand exactly what was going on with the curse. Where was I at? Galatians 3:10. Okay, sorry, I started losing my place there. So Israel, the history of Israel and the human experience in general is that there was a fall, but that God demands something from us, right? But what he demands from us in order to be right with him, we can't do. So from the very beginning, he promised to make a way, right? Can anyone just tell me a verse, and thinking of Old Testament, where did God promise to make a way? Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot. I literally don't have this in my notes, but I just was like, I bet someone could probably come up with one.
There's the parting of the Red Sea, when God says, you're going to go over here to the Red Sea and I'll make a way for you.
Yes, there is a lot of typology in the Old Testament that points to this consistent theme that God is putting you up against impossible things. You can't cross the Red Sea. You can't live up to the law. I'm going to make a way. Well, even in the garden, right? In Genesis 3. Right? God gives them the curse because they sinned, but God promises he's going to make a way. All of the big covenants in the Bible, the Abrahamic covenant, right? The Davidic covenant, all the covenants we see when God makes a covenant with God's representation at that moment in the biblical narrative, there's always like, I'm going to do these things, and you're probably going to screw up, but in the end, ultimately, I will make a way, right? There's going to be a Messiah coming. I'm going to take care of it for you, right? We see that consistently throughout the Old Testament. And that's why, point number 3 that I didn't write up there because I've been talking too much, is that the gospel of faith is in the Old Testament. So, all right. Now, moving along, and man, I'm already starting to run out of time. That's fine. We're having fun talking about stuff. So as we look at these points, though, I'm going to write down some different verses up here, and we're going to like break apart here in a second. Not really break up, but just spend a minute or two if you got your Bibles and just like let's thumb through and look together about what Paul is saying on these different points. Because what I want us to see is the gospel thread through Galatians. And the importance of the gospel thread through Galatians is that Paul is also pointing to the gospel thread that already existed in the Old Testament. All right? So, first off, understanding how this fits in the overall message, I said number 1 was only one gospel. And I see that in a few different places. There was 1:4, which we already read, but I also think verse 6. What we have here is Paul already laying out his understanding about this is what the gospel is, and you remember he's already laying out his points to the Judaizers. And we have a constant battle as parents, me and Kiva, with our kids of getting distracted, our children getting distracted. Verse 6, Paul says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, right? So the first thing I thought of when I was reading that was like, it's like my kids. I tell my kids, go put your shoes on, and I go up and check on them. I give them clear direction, and when I get up there, somehow their shoes aren't on. In fact, now their socks are off, and they decided to get out toys, and there's now marker on them for some reason. Like, what happened in 5 minutes? This is how Paul is feeling. He's like, he was just here with them. They just believed in the gospel, and he's astonished that you're so quickly distracted. You're so quickly led astray by a different gospel that I didn't already teach you. So there is only one gospel. Paul is saying, look, there's one thing. I gave you one instruction. It was clear, and you're adding to it. You're making a mess of things. The second thing, Paul opposing Peter, right? We see that in a few specific places, but some of the key verses are, let's see, 12 through 13. Now, there's a lot of it in there, but I think those are the most obvious things where he's kind of laying out the understanding. But some of the key verses for the faith of the gospel in the Old Testament, we see, let's see, 6 through 7, and then 9 and 10. Running out of room. 9 and 10 there. And then I'm gonna keep knocking out some of these. And then we have the logic, number 4. The logic of the gospel. That is in 3:3 and 18. Yeah, please take notes on that, and you can look at that. But this was my exercise of just looking at the gospel through the lens of the gospel in Galatians, with just that one point in mind here. So, looking at Paul opposing Peter, there is a specific story that's going on there with Paul opposing Peter. We'll look at verses 12 and 13 of chapter 2. He says this, "For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles," he being Peter. "But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party," or the Judaizers, "and the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." So Paul is pointing out that that Peter was not following the gospel already, the gospel that he already knows well. One of my favorite verses in the New Testament, Galatians 1:10, "For am I now seeking approval of man or of God, or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Paul, or Peter, is not doing that. That's what Paul's calling him out on, saying, hey, look, there's these other people that you thought you needed to impress, therefore you walked away, and you being Peter, other people followed you. Even Barnabas, who was a new believer that Paul had been discipling, you're leading my disciples astray, is what Paul's saying. He is angry that Peter decided to be more concerned about what people thought of him than what the gospel told him to do. So Paul is opposing Peter. So why do you think Paul put that? This didn't happen here and now. That wasn't the point of the book of Galatians. But why do you think Paul put the story of him having to oppose Peter in there? That's not rhetorical. Why do you think Paul put that story in there?
As maybe like a lesson for other believers.
Mm-hmm.
To be encouraged to call other believers out when they're doing the same thing.
Yeah. So what was going on in Galatia?
That's a great question. Can I make a guess? Were they, I know like the Galatians, like they weren't the Jews. And so, like the Jews were trying to say like, hey, you need to, in order to be a Christian, you have to do all these traditions that you've been doing for years. Is that kind of
Right. So Paul opposed Peter for the exact same reason that he is now frustrated that the Judaizers are coming in, right? So he's already kind of laying out saying, look, here's an example of me already having to lay this out. Not only is it just with another believer, but it's Peter of all people. Yeah, one of the apostles that has been led astray. And so this is a serious matter. He's using it as an example, and it's got a lot of weight to it because it is Peter that he's talking about, right? And Peter and Paul, yeah, there's this kind of thing that goes back and forth with him in the New Testament, but ultimately they respect each other and even say highly of each other, that what they say is the word of God, right? They're calling each other the apostles and saying, like, when they're speaking for God when he's writing these things. And so this was a true thing. If you know Peter's story in Acts, he also, God slaps him upside the head by giving him a vision of unclean food and God telling him to eat these things. And the vision is saying, don't think that you have to then act like a Jew anymore, that these Gentiles aren't good enough, that they need to come to your side. Like, no, you go to them, right? We're in a new covenant. And so Paul is reminding them of, they might already know this story. We don't know if they do or don't know this story yet, but he is putting it in here at the very beginning of his explanation to the Galatians to show them that this is important. So much so that he even had to make this theological point, a credible theological point with Peter of all people, right? Then we also have the gospel of faith in the Old Testament. Some of the key, that's in like chapter 3, 6 to 14, but some of the key points are verses 6 and 7. I'll read those real quick. It says, just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, know then that it is those of faith who are sons of Abraham, right? Now, if you remember in the Gospels, Jesus, when he would face off with the Pharisees, sometimes they would claim that they are themselves sons of Abraham, right? And Jesus usually had some fighting words to say with them of, no, you think you're sons of Abraham because you do X, Y, and Z, but that's not the point. And Paul is continuing to lay this out here, just like Jesus did, saying that, no, the sons of Abraham are those that have faith, right? So to the Judaizers that would have been likely reading this message, that would have stuck out like a sore thumb, okay? And then verse 9 says, so then those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith, right? The Old Testament believers, what they did, they looked forward on the basis of the work that God would do with the promised Messiah. That's where their faith is, right? Because we always think about, it's a struggle thinking Old Testament, what was going on? Where was their faith? Did they have to have all these laws in correct order in order to be found righteous with God? Well, no. We see in the Old Testament that it is still faith. They look forward knowing that God will do what he says he does through the Messiah, just like we look backwards knowing that God has done what he said he will do with the Messiah, and we all look forward to the great day of the Lord where he comes and sets all things right. Okay? So we're kind of on that same, we're on that same continuum with the Old Testament saints, but we're just kind of on a different slot, right? But both of us, Old Testament, New Testament, we look to what Christ did, his death, burial, and resurrection with faith. And each, the Old Testament believers and us as New Testament, New Covenant believers, we're included by faith in the promise of God's covenant with Abraham. Going back to the Old Testament, both of us are included with that. It's not we're not erasing the Old Covenant with Abraham. This is a continuation of it. This is the fulfillment of it. And then in verse 10, it says, for all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Right? And that's why it is important that Jesus, who was cursed for us and nailed on a tree, he took that curse on. He did all those things, and so he abided by them. So according to this, which is a quote from the Old Testament, he did those things. That's looking at Deuteronomy and saying you're cursed if you don't do them. But Christ did all the things perfectly, but yet took on the curse for us. So the gospel of faith is already seen in the Old Testament. That is what the Messiah would do for all people. So then we have the logic of faith, of the gospel of faith, and that is 3:3 and 18. Those are the hinge verses, but really there's a lot there. Kind of most of the chapter of 3, I think you can see Paul laying out his logical arguments. But 3:3, where he's getting real angry at him, he says, are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit? Are you now perfected by the flesh? Meaning, hey, you didn't start this. The Spirit, the Holy Spirit, God working in you, started your salvation. Do you think you can now add to it with your measly attempts at things? Are you going to make your salvation more sure because you've tried harder? And so he's kind of laying out this logic of, it didn't start this way. How could it possibly end this other way? Right? And then verse 18 says, for if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise. But God gave it to Abraham as a promise. Right? So he's laying out this logic of this if-then, of if it started with the Spirit, it's going to end with the Spirit. But then also in the Old Testament, if God started it with a promise to Abraham, he's going to continue it with a promise. It's not, here's a promise, now you got to work for it, right? It's that idea of when you get a free gift, you don't have to pay for the gift that you get on your birthday. It is a gift. One of the things that popped into my head as I was thinking through that, I was like, what's like a practical way, like a picture to get in our mind about it? And I started thinking about like a scared, inexperienced tandem parachuter, right? You know what a tandem parachuter is? It's when you're like strapped to the other dude and they're going to jump out together, whee, right? And it's like, okay, once you're flying down, it's like, okay, I got it. This is fun. The parachute's open. I'm safe. Like, I got it now. I'm on my own. Let me go. And they decide to rip the cord and just jump off on their own. Well, they don't have their own parachute. So they started by somebody else's power, knowledge, and experience, the parachuter that they are strapped to. So it would be really foolish of them to detach thinking that they got it from there then on, right? I'm going to just hop out and I'll be on my own. And that's essentially what Paul is saying. Is like, you started this with the most powerful, experienced person in the world, the creator of all things. He's the one that started it. Why would you think you can finish it on your own? That's just ridiculous. It's insanity. It is not logical. So the logic of the faith that Paul is laying out there. And then the next point was the freedom. I'm running out of room here. The freedom. This is a really big point in all of Paul's writing, because the opposite of being trapped by the law is freedom. The freedom of the gospel. And that is some of the key points. There's a lot of key points here. 3:22, 29. I mean, there's a ton. I'm going to read a couple of those as we go here. 3:22 says, "But the scripture imprisoned everything under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe." Right? So we have the word imprisonment there. Right? Verse 29, "And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." That language comes up a lot. Heirs according to the promise. Could someone enlighten us a little bit when we see the word heirs in the New Testament, in really the Old Testament as well? What is being communicated thinking about heirs? H-E-I-R-S, heirs.
It's not something that we earned. It was something that was given to us.
Right. What is an heir?
An heir is, in the strictest sense, someone has died and given you something.
Okay.
It's a birthright, basically.
Yeah, but before that person dies, what are you as an heir? Like, what's your status before that person dies? We're just going to flesh it out here a little bit. They're a child. Yeah, right? So what's over you when you're a child? Yeah, authority, right? You guys are completely tracking there. That makes so much sense. Paul, we're running out of time. I'm keep looking at my watch because it's hard to cover an entire book in like 45 minutes, right? But that's what we're trying to do, because I want you to be able to feel like you have this, especially as you're going back into Romans in the coming weeks. I want you to feel like you've got this understanding. You're under authority. That's the logic that Paul lays out here. You're jumping ahead in my notes. That is the logic Paul lays out about what an heir is. Before an heir has the full freedom of the person that's taken on the inheritance, if we're going to use that example. That's in chapter 4 of looking at sons and heirs. They are essentially underneath that authority, kind of enslaved to the rules of the ruling house, whatever that may be, whether that's, a nanny or dad, whatever we're going to look at in that regard. But when that person dies, when they inherit the thing, then they have full rights and freedom, right? And so what Paul is saying is, in the Old Testament, the law that it showed us our sin, as he was saying, what was that, in verse 22, I think? Here's an example. Verse 25 says, "But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith." So the guardian was the bumpers set up through the law, right? That was to keep them, for lack of better terms, on the straight and narrow, but it wasn't to keep them, it wasn't to save them, because only faith saved them as they were between the bumpers of the law, because they ultimately couldn't do it. Because God laid out the law and says, you're not going to live up to this, but I have a plan, right? And it always pointed to the Messiah coming. And so what we see there, the freedom of the gospel, is that the gospel sets us free from the bumpers of the law. We don't have to try and live up to that anymore. Not that we're going to go willy-nilly and act crazy, but we're no longer underneath the chains as a child being nannied by the law, because now we have the full freedom of the gospel of Christ through the Holy Spirit that lives in us. So there's the freedom of the gospel of faith. And that is something that, culturally, the Jews, the Judaizers, the Pharisees, they couldn't wrap their minds around, apart from the Holy Spirit, enlightening them of that fact. That is why this was a constant debate going back and forth throughout the New Testament of the Jews versus the Gentile believers, and trying to understand what it looks like for faith versus law, right? That's great. You guys were totally tracking with that. I don't know if I just hadn't thought through the logic of all of that. You guys totally got it. That's what Paul is laying out in there, trying to explain that. And then finally, we have the fruit of the gospel. And I think this that's a lot of points there, I know. But I think that is the gospel being laid out in Galatians. And again, the summary verse of why Paul wrote it, him essentially preaching the gospel in one sentence, specifically to the Galatian church, dealing with the Judaizers, trying to bring them underneath the boot of the law. Paul lays it out, I think, in verse 1-4. It's fantastic. But this is some of the key points here. 5:21b. Can someone read that? It's like the last, that's a B, not a 6. Can someone read 21b? It's like the last sentence of 5:21.
I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God.
Okay, that's rough. And we're running out of time to talk about all of it, but right before that, the previous 3 verses, he's laying out what the works of the flesh look like. Okay? And that one, I think, would behoove you to go read that in several translations to just really understand. Like I said, words like fornication just don't really have the same gravitas to us in modern times. So looking at some different translations is really helpful. But he is laying out things that are selfish, things that are self-seeking, whether that be sexual sin, whether that be anger, right? Anger is a self-seeking thing. I'm a person that struggles with anger. Why am I mad? Because I didn't get my way. Boo-hoo, right? And so then I'll throw a temper. It's selfish, right? The root of the sin is not the anger itself. It's what's behind it. The root of the sin of sexual things, it's not just the act itself. It's what's behind it. It's the selfishness. It's the pride. It's the self-centeredness. Those are the problems. Who can tell me what the fruits of the Spirit are? Which is 22 through 23.
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control.
And what's it say after that?
Against such things there is no law.
Right. Those are the things that the nanny of the law has nothing to say about. That is what we are supposed to do. So the law is all the things we do, that the Old Testament law, that is all the things we do that are outside of those things. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, anger. That's my problem. Gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. See, the law, that's why there's no law against those things, because those things are the summation of what is good. Those are the fruit of the Spirit. And a lot of commentators will point out the fact that in the Greek, it is not plural. It's not the fruits of the Spirit. We're not going to be like, I'm going to work on this one thing. I'm real good at self-control or whatever. It's like, no, if you have these things in increasing measure, you have the Spirit. The Spirit is evident in your life. This is what the life of a person that is following Christ looks like. They have all of those things. Not that we're perfect and we get it right all the time, but there is a continued upward growth of those things. Verse 24, can someone read that for me? Yes, sir.
And those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires.
Awesome. That I think is the example of the fruit of the gospel of faith. Because what Paul said earlier in the book, right, is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So this is the practical outworking of a person whose life has been crucified with Christ. They have crucified their life of their passions and their desires. They're living a life where there isn't need for for bumpers, for a nanny, for laws to be around them, because they are walking in the Spirit. They have the fruit of the Spirit. And this is the gospel in Galatians. Verse 1:4 in the New Living says, Jesus gave his life for our sins, just as God our Father planned, in order to rescue us from this evil world in which we live. And through faith alone, Galatians 5:25, since we are living by the Spirit, let us follow the Spirit's leading in every part of our lives. That, I think, is the summary from start to finish of the gospel that's found in Galatians. Like I said, we can look at Galatians and make different types of outlines to learn different things about it. But what I wanted us to see, knowing where you guys have been at in Romans and the connection that Galatians and Romans have with each other, is what is most important. What's most important is understanding that faith is all we need. There's nothing I can do. Once I started jumping out of the plane of faith, right, with the Holy Spirit, there's no reason that I need to detach myself from the Holy Spirit and try and live my life on my own, because God's given me everything I need and continues to grow those things through me. That's why the fruit of the Spirit is such an important part of the New Testament gospel presentation. That's how we understand what it looks like, that we are being led by the Spirit in every part of our lives. We will see the fruits of the Spirit grow in us consistently. And people will look at us and be like, how are you doing this? And it's always like, I don't know, man. It's not me. Like, I didn't just decide I'm going to try harder, right? That's something that I deal with my little kids with, right? Well, having that conversation of why do you continue to not do what we ask you to do? And I was talking to my son yesterday about it. He's like, I don't know. I don't ever think about it. I just do it, right? He's just without thinking, he's just choosing the wrong thing. We're not even really, not actively choosing. And we all know that. We've all experienced that and still experience that to this day. But what a life that looks like, that is not succumbing to the whims and the wills of our immature, wishy-washy, physical, sinful self, we are looking like this, that we are living by the Spirit. We are following the Spirit's leading in every part of our lives, Galatians 5:25. And that's what I want us to see. That is the gospel in Galatians. No longer being under the boot of the law, but free in Christ to live out a life that reflects Christ, that is being led by the Spirit.
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor of Young Adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and the sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.